So with me today, I'm very excited to talk to Deputy Chief Jeremy Rush, like Bosch, like one of my other favorite cops, Bosch. And he is talking with me today about a missing persons case, and that's of Jerry Strege. And it was an interesting way that this case came to me. I was talking to the father of one of my friends who, I'm going to call you Jeremy. What was John's title, Jeremy? Like a warden?
Yeah, John was a warden at a correctional facility near the city of Waupun, and he's a resident in this area.
Yeah. So we were at a party for his granddaughter, her graduation party, and John starts talking to me about Jerry's case. And I was like, well, no, this is interesting, but it's a small town and, I'll see what sort of elements there are. And I will just be honest with you, Jeremy, I took a deep dive and I was like, I couldn't believe the amount of information about Jerry's case. Like, this must have been pretty big in your area because I found more news articles than I can shake a stick at. And before we go any further, I also have to tell you that you sent me the most magnificent press kit I've ever seen in my life. I feel like you should teach workshops to other law enforcement agencies because it is complete and fantastic, and you answered a bunch of questions before I could ask them. So props to you, sir.
Well, I appreciate that. It kind of helps me keep some of this case organized just for the fact that I wasn't the investigating officer. I was actually a patrol officer for about 10 months when this call came in. So over the years, we've kind of reviewed this case, and mid to late 2019, we decided let's take another look at this. And we've always kind of looked at it, but we didn't dive into it as maybe thick as I thought we should have.
Well, I can tell you the press kit that you have is pretty magnificent. I mean, honestly, I've dealt with law enforcement agencies across the country, some large, some small, some medium-sized, but this is the most comprehensive amount of information. I mean, you saved me hours of time. I still end up diving in because there's a lot of elements to this case that I sure didn't see coming. There's a lot of reasons why people are still questioning why he's missing. So, but your media kit, your press kit was stellar. I mean, seriously, you should teach workshops on this. And I know that that John, the warden, had told me a few things about the case, but the thing he was most excited about is that you were reopening the case and taking another look. He was really happy to hear that.
Yeah, and I don't think we ever really closed it, but we never really dove into it, from the initial first couple of years. Never really dove into it really deep. And there are a lot of other people that are involved in this with me, and just doing searches over the last year and putting this information together. I do appreciate everybody else who has taken the time on this. But you're right.
Oh, I know it takes a village. Yeah.
But there is some different avenues that you look at in this case, and you can't say it's not a homicide, and you can't say it's not a suicide, and you can't say it's not just a missing person because it's different. It
is. It's a very different case. I was really, like I said, when John told me about it, I was like, I'll take a look at this. That's very sweet of him to talk to me about it when he found out, I host this podcast. And I was like, oh, like every turn I took was a different one. It made me, this is really fascinating. And I reached out to you, and you were so respectful. You took a while to get back to me because you wanted to talk it over with the family. And I really appreciated that.
Right. And that's, I think, the key to a lot of this investigation is that relationship that you have with the family of Jerry, the ones that are still around. I know his parents are deceased at this point, but I think there would be nothing better that we could do for his family, and including his parents, to get answers.
Absolutely. That's the main goal, is getting answers to, such a, in my mind now, it's become an even bigger mystery. So let's just go over some of the details. So Jerry Strege was like a 25-year employee of the Dodge Correctional Institute. He was a corrections officer. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was a correctional officer at Dodge Correction in the city of Waupun. But prior to that, he worked at Waupun Correctional Institute in the city of Waupun. We're kind of a different community. We got 3 correctional facilities within our city limits. And, in 1983, he was also a victim during a riot where inmates took over Waupun Correctional. So I think that's kind of an interesting part of this case.
That's a big part, and we will get to that. So it is interesting that your kind of small town has 3 large correctional institutes. I mean, that's pretty interesting. And from what I understand, the Dodge Correctional Institute is the first place that felons in Wisconsin go, and then they're sort of sorted out to different institutions. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's an intake facility, but they have anybody from, all the way up to a maximum, offender. So minimum, medium, and maximum offenders that are in that facility.
So we'll get to the hostage situation in 1983 involving Jerry, but let's just talk a little bit about him when he disappeared. He was 43 years old. And in my mind, I mean, I get it. If you disappear and something happens to your outside visage, it doesn't matter how big you are. But he was a substantial human being. He was like 6'3" and 230 pounds, something like that. He was a big guy.
Correct. Yeah, he was a large man and an athletic man.
Right. He was almost really like a semi-pro golfer. That's another point I wanted to bring out. I had a couple of questions about that too. I don't know much about the golf world, but what I do know is that people that play are obsessed. Like it becomes a huge part of their life. And it sounds like Jerry in particular get obsessed with the game, and it becomes kind of all encompassing. Like it was a big part of his life.
Yeah, golf was a huge part of his life. Even family made mention that he worked as a correctional officer so he could golf.
Right. That makes sense. Right.
And he was a very avid amateur within the state of Wisconsin, won some major tournaments on the amateur tour, and generally placed pretty high in a lot of these pro-am and tournaments and some of the amateur tournaments in the state. And
like the last message he sent via text was to a friend after they'd played a tournament, and he said, thanks for playing at the Stevens Point Scramble. I'll see you on the 20th, meaning the 20th of October, when they were signed up to play another tournament. So it's like the last message he sent was to his friend. And even though they had played apparently not great that day, he's still the kind of guy, it's something I respect greatly, the kind of guy that sends a message to his friend, hey, thanks for playing. That's a person with a good heart and a good soul. You don't hear a lot of, and no offense because you're a dude, but you don't hear a lot of dudes, sending a thank you to their friend. Like, hey, thanks for playing today. Right. And, that to me just showed a lot of who he was.
And I think with Jerry, he was a pretty private person. So if you got in Jerry's inner circle, you were lucky to be in that inner circle. So those that were in that circle, he treated well.
I believe that. To me, you can hear it in the wording of that message. I mean, it's short and sweet, but to say to your friend, hey, thanks for playing today. I mean, I don't know, that to me, that shows a lot. That's the kind of thing you would hope all your friends would send you, but probably most of your friends don't. They just take it for granted that, hey, I'm so glad we played today, but he made it, tangible for his, friend to read and hear. And here's another, we'll go over the list, the pros and cons of why it may have been suicide, why it may have been an abduction and a possible murder, why it may have been an accident, and why it may have been him leaving his life for something else. We'll go over all those things. But he was, mentioning, I'll see you on the 20th, mentioning to his friend Bill about, a tournament they were going to play in Rolling Hills. We can talk about the psychology of someone who may want to end their life. That's always a big question for me. If they're talking about future plans, do they just pivot and then, I don't want to be here anymore, and take themselves out? I mean, I know that's a rhetorical question, but that left a big question in my mind. that, his last text was kind of about the future.
Right. And I think there was other tournaments in there too. I mean, he planned to play on the 5th and the 6th of October, right, but was obviously a no-show for that.
Which is one of those questions I have about the timing, about how long, when we're adults, we don't always check in with our parents, with our family, so maybe a couple of days go by, but there seems to be a pretty big gap as to when the last time he was heard from, doesn't show up for these 2 tournaments and then doesn't show up for work. And that's when his father finally does a welfare check. But so let's backtrack a little bit. So that's the last message was October 1st, I guess, with his friend Bill, who he just played the tournament with. And then he didn't show up on, like you said, the 5th and 6th for 2 other golf tournaments. And that was probably pretty surprising, I'm guessing, to his friends. Is that what you've kind of heard?
Yeah, 100%. Very surprising.
Yeah, because it seems like it was kind of the love of his life. I mean, I read a quote, from one of his friends who was like, I don't think he left of his own free, I don't think he walked away from his life because he left his prized golf clubs. I mean, that's right. pretty important right there. October 1st, he talks to his friend Bill via text. October 3rd, he writes in his checkbook a deposit. The 5th and 6th, he doesn't show up for 2 different tournaments. The 8th and 9th, he doesn't show up for work. No phone call, no nothing. And the 9th, his father goes to the apartment and was like, why isn't he answering his phone? So obviously, after a while, I don't know if the Dodge Correctional Institution contacted his family or how they, or if his dad was just like, I can't get a hold of him, I'm going to check it out myself.
I believe his dad checked to see if he was around, and then he contacted Dodge after that.
Okay, and then found out that he hadn't
been to work.
Yeah, okay. His dad finds, here's, some other questions I have. His dad finds his wallet and his cell phone laying out, TV on in the back bedroom, his car and his motorcycle are at his home, but he is gone.
Yes.
Do you know if his front door was locked?
His front door, according to his father, was said to be unlocked,
okay,
but it was closed.
Right.
There was some confusion, I think, early on from some other people that I think the rumors spread that his door was wide open. But
isn't it amazing the way details
they change?
I mean, yeah. Just from it's like a really crappy version of the telephone game.
Right.
I mean, it's like I just had a phone call this morning with someone who was like, "Oh, someone was murdered in that house. The husband murdered the wife." And I'm like, "Really?" And then I find out, no, the husband hung himself in the garage. Completely different. So yeah, it's the way rumors fly and details. So the fact that you probably are pretty sure from his dad that the door was closed but maybe not locked, that's kind of interesting. So it looked like there was no disturbance.
Disturbance. Yeah, no forced entry. That, we didn't receive any phone calls from other citizens or residents in that area.
Right.
And the thing is, it was an apartment complex, and there's other apartment complexes adjacent to that one complex. So if there was a disturbance, it's highly likely that we would have got contacted.
Someone would have heard something. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the media kit you sent. It's like, you have the placement of his apartment, what it looks out onto, the people that are, living around there. Really smart. It's like, obviously the original investigators pounded the pavement, and then you or whoever compiled this list it's pretty inclusive. I mean, it's really pretty all inclusive. There's not a lot of questions I had left after reading it. I was like, this is the most comprehensive thing I've ever read on a case of a missing person. It really is. I mean, you have his apartment number, you have what it's facing. It's kind of spectacular. There's like not a lot of questions left. So he lived in this apartment complex. So let's talk about that. He lived in this apartment complex, I'm guessing, because he was divorced?
No, he was single for a long time. Yeah, he was divorced at one point, but it was a marriage that was in the 80s, and they were only married for maybe a year. I think it was
Oh,
less than
okay.
a year. So
Okay.
that marriage wasn't a long-term marriage, and it did not end in a bad way.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah, because I'd read some things that said he was in the middle of a messy divorce, which that's obviously not true.
No, it was like 20 years prior that he got
Oh,
divorced.
then yeah, that's not, he's probably not still hanging on to that.
Right.
I get that. It seems like he picked this apartment because it's close to where a country club where he played golf a lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that would make sense. We do have a golf country club in the city of Waupun. Prior to that, he lived in Fond du Lac, which is a city to the north of us, for a period of time. But typically, he was a resident of Waupun.
Okay. So he lived in this apartment. It wasn't that he hated where he lived. It was not far away from his workplace. He'd been there for 25 years. From all accounts, he enjoyed his job. He didn't hate his job. But then let's get to the issue in 1983. He was held hostage during a prison riot, and it sounds pretty horrific.
Yeah, he was definitely a victim of assaultive actions, and I believe, just by speaking with family and other people, that this caused some mental distress on him, probably for the rest of his life, up until he went missing.
Right. So he was basically stripped of his clothing and stood up on a table, but surrounded by newspaper and fuel, and told that if they didn't get what they wanted, he would be set on fire and burned alive.
Yes, that's correct.
It wasn't, I mean, I can't imagine anything more horrible than being held hostage by someone with like a gun to your head, except for someone threatening to set you on fire and burn you alive if they don't get what they want. I mean, traumatic is definitely a word that would describe that. I'm not sure how one gets past that. And it's, no one's business, but I wonder if he got any, professional help or counseling because of that.
Right. And you got to remember, at this time in 1983, Waupun Correctional was the maximum prison in the state of Wisconsin. So it's not like you had minimum and medium security men in there. A lot of these people had already been convicted of homicide.
So they didn't have much to lose in their mind.
Correct.
What's one more, on their notch on their belt? And one of the articles I'd found from 2007, I guess there was another sort of a prison riot where a female was taken hostage for 5 hours. She was held in a windowless room, but she said, she wasn't hurt, but it brought up, memories of the 1983 riot. And they did speak to Jerry's father about, I'm sure that brought it all back to the family.
Yeah, I think every time something happened at that facility, it probably brought back difficult times for them.
Yeah, especially when they have no answer as to, where their family member is. Just people don't just vanish, and yet they do. I mean,
Right.
we can see that they do. So there's the divorce, which isn't as big of a deal as I thought it was. There's the prison riot, which probably affected him the rest of his life and up to when he's missing. There are I don't know, you have a different name for them, like DUI, driving under the influence. What do you call them in Wisconsin?
Operating while intoxicated or impaired.
Okay, OWI. Okay, I knew it was a different, yeah. So he had gotten a fourth one, and he had 3 since 1999. So that's within 3-4 years. He had 4 operating while intoxicated. And the last one, I believe, was he had a crash on his motorcycle.
Yeah, that's correct. So you kind of see that, maybe drinking is starting to take or becoming more active in his life, and maybe causing him some issues. And is that based on what happened in 1983?
Right.
Probably a good possibility.
That would be my guess. I mean, I'm no doctor. I can tell you, having lost my husband, if I didn't have a grief counselor, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. And I think a lot of people find shame in talking to someone about issues. But, a lot of times I feel like I didn't think of it pro or con. I didn't think it's so courageous of me to talk to someone. What I thought was about 5 days after my husband died, if I don't get help, shit's going to go south really fast. So I'm grateful that I have this amazing grief counselor who's really helped me a lot. But I know a lot of people don't reach out for help, and then things like an addiction that you may not have had raises its head because you don't have anywhere else to go or a place to process the feelings. So he had maybe started drinking heavier, or that it was found out he was drinking because he kept getting citations. So do you know if this upcoming court case, which would have been the following year in the spring in 2003, do you know if that really weighed heavily on his mind?
Yeah, it sounded like, talking with family, friends, and other people around him, that he was fearful that he would lose his job, obviously, number one, and he was also fearful that he'd be incarcerated. And being a correctional officer, he knows what that means when you're incarcerated in a facility. At that time, would he went to prison for OWI 4? I don't think so, but he probably would have seen some jail time.
Right. Right.
And talking with family about his alcohol use, didn't seem like he was an everyday drinker, but when he drank, it was a binge drink. So maybe bad things happened when he started drinking, and he couldn't stop that.
That makes sense. Like just reading interviews with his friends, no one mentioned an everyday, like you said, abuse of alcohol. But it would make sense that if he did drink, maybe he just drank to excess and it went, south from there. That makes sense. Do you think he would have lost, and I know you can't really answer, but do you think he would have lost his job because of the fourth OWI?
It was possible. I do know at that time, though, there were correctional officers that did have 3 or 4 OWIs. Number 5 was one that you didn't want because at that time it became a felony.
Right.
It was possible, but it was also possible if you were a good employee to save your job.
Right. Maybe they would, make him go to rehab or something to keep him on the, on the job.
Right. Like rehab, EAP, something like that. 100% possible to keep your job, but I think he was definitely worried that he was going to lose it.
Right. That makes sense. Let's talk about another theory. I mean, you're making a great point that it would be worrisome if you're a correctional officer and you worry about getting jail time and then what could happen to you. I mean, that I hadn't thought of. I hadn't thought about him worrying about jail time. What I thought about was him worrying about losing his job. But either one of those two things would be very devastating, and I get that. I'm still not sure it's enough to make, because it's the unknown. And like you said, there were remedies that could keep either of those things from happening. I'm not sure that's enough of a reason to commit suicide. But if it's piling on to certain things,
right.
It might
how depressed was he at that point?
Exactly.
We don't know what his mental state of mind was.
Right. So his friends describe him as, quiet sometimes or moody. And his father said his personality definitely changed after the hostage situation. And one would expect that somebody would act differently. You don't know how long, you don't know how people are going to process things, and you don't know how long it's going to take for someone to, move on. And maybe he just had never had a chance to move on with what happened. And that living in fear, that's a lot of pressure, maybe worried about, what happened. So let's talk about Thomas Deering. So he had escaped just before Jerry went missing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was right around the same time. I believe, was it the second or the third?
Yeah. And he was one of the participants in the riot?
No.
Oh, he wasn't. Okay.
No.
Okay. So all right. See, that's why I'm glad you're here. But because honestly, I mean, I always prefer to start with law enforcement because you have the correct information. And as much as I love journalism and journalists, shit like this happens and things get, incorrectly reported. So Mr. Deering wasn't personally associated with Jerry. He just happened to have escaped. And it sort of is thought that he had nothing to do with Jerry's disappearance, right?
Yeah, Mr. Deering, he escaped in a soda truck. He somehow carved out the inside of some pallets within that truck, and he got a ride to Lamartine, Wisconsin, which is between Waupun and Fond du Lac. And I believe he got out of that truck there when they were doing a delivery. And ultimately, a female party picked him up. Didn't know he was an inmate. She had nothing to do with, his escape. Drove him to Fond du Lac, and then ultimately he was located in California.
So she just had a broken picker that she gives a ride to a piece of shit, and then this is the low rent version of Shawshank.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So he doesn't have anything to do with that. I'm so proud that he made it all the way to California. That's aces.
Well, he escaped another time in at Columbia Correctional over by Portage.
So he's kind of the Wisconsin Houdini,
I guess.
So let's go over another theory. Some friends thought that, and I this was a new one to me. Did he have a deer stand in the marsh that's close to his home?
He hunted probably as a younger adult.
Okay.
To the northwest of Waupun, probably about 40 minutes. So it wasn't near his residence.
Okay.
So A, his car's at home, B, his motorcycle's at home, and
right.
C, his bicycle got stolen or lost over the summer. I don't think he could have made it there. So
I was going to say, would he walk a mile to check a deer stand? So there's just, like one theory that was put out there is that he went to check his deer stand, which I didn't know he had one. And then there was an accident somehow, and he got injured and couldn't get his way back. And that's why no one ever found him. Does that make any sense?
Not that I can really wrap it around, but anything's possible. So, I mean, there's also the Horicon Marsh, which he was very familiar with, and it's probably about 2 miles as a crow flies from his residence.
Right.
So the old location, 40 minutes from Waupun, he no longer hunted there, but it was his favorite hunting location. But he was very, very familiar with the Horicon Marsh. So is there a possibility that he went out to the Horicon Marsh hunting? Yes, possible, but nothing to corroborate it.
So one of the things that John had mentioned to me in our discussion when he brought the case to my attention is that the Waupun Police Department had maybe dredged the marsh.
We did not dredge a marsh. Recently, we were out by a quarry that was near Dodge Correctional.
Okay.
And we drained the entire quarry with the help of the landowner, who is a great guy and a fantastic farmer. And ultimately, we excavated with his crew all the muck and other materials on the bottom of that quarry, and that area was searched, and we did not locate Jerry.
Was it thought that he would have, if he were to end his own life, he would have gone to that quarry?
That was one of the theories from back in the early 2000s that I located in some reports. I know back then it was searched with cadaver dogs, and there were some alerts that there was possibly human remains. And in 2020 and 2021, we brought back the cadaver dogs, and we were getting some additional indicators that there's a possibility of human remains. So that was our next avenue.
Okay. Then is that what the next search will be in the fall?
The search, again, will be cadaver dogs, drone, some other equipment that we have for a different location.
So I'm guessing the quarry is pretty big.
Correct. The quarry was big. I think we pumped out, I don't know how many millions of gallons of water, but it was cleared of water within a couple of days. And then excavating took quite a bit of time also. Of
course. So the next search will involve cadaver dogs and drones, like you said. Will that You said another location, which you don't have to disclose to me, but will that also include the marsh, or is that sort of off the list at this point?
Not in the marsh, but probably, I can say it's closer to his residence. I did locate in reports from early 2000s that this area was not searched because it was too wet. There was too much
Mm,
water at that time. In the past couple of years, it's been somewhat dry here,
right.
so the water has basically diminished, and it gives us an opportunity to get in there with dog teams and other search teams.
So I'm gonna just ask your professional opinion. Are you a fan of human remains detection dogs?
I think they're real strong if it's a recent death.
Right.
As time goes by, it becomes more difficult.
Yeah, I
And
think so too.
and I think the handlers would agree with that. I mean,
I think they would too. The honest, ethical ones, I think they would too.
yeah,
I've
you're
had,
looking for
yeah,
a needle in a haystack in essence. And
basically, even as tall and substantial as Jerry was, you don't leave a lot if we're 75% water. So if something happens that we're no longer alive, you don't leave a lot. I mean, I've done a I volunteered on a couple of searches, and things that surprised me was that if you find a bone, it looks like a stick. They don't look white and gleaming like in TV shows.
right,
You could easily pass over a bone, and also areas of the ground where someone has expired. It the body releases something called putrescine that kind of burns the ground. So you look for an area that's either, if it's recent, you look for an area that's kind of black and burned, or you look for where grass has grown really tall in a certain area because, our bodies, fertilize the ground pretty much. So it's very interesting. And I love dogs. I sent you a picture of my, asshole dog, and I love her. And she's kind of, she's the breed, she's Belgian Malinois, which are now being used by law enforcement quite a bit because they're easy to train and they're a little lighter than German
right,
Shepherds.
right.
Not mine because I feed her too many treats, but I love dogs and I have my whole life. I don't put a lot of faith in search dogs. I'm grateful for that resource. And I think you're right. If it's a newer person missing, I think it can be really helpful. But I think it's a difficult thing. But I'm glad you're using everything, all the tools at your disposal to try and find him.
And I think it goes
So,
case by case with these
right.
search dogs. Like within a quarry and water, there's a lot of other natural scents that could possibly confuse a dog.
Be distracting. Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right, so let's talk about the suicide theory. There are a few things that are, pro suicide in my mind. The pending court date about the OWI, worrying about losing his job. You're adding in the fact that he is a corrections officer and it would have been very difficult for him to do any time in any sort of, lockup. Makes sense. Potentially PTSD from the riot from 1983, and the last game he played with his friend Bill, they didn't play well. I don't know that that's enough, but those are some things that could have led him to kill himself. The cons are that his friends and family just did not think he was suicidal, that he was making plans for the future with future tournaments, that he talked to his friend Bill, William, about upcoming tournaments and said thank you. He didn't say thank you and I'll see you in the next life. It
Right.
just there's probably more pros to the theory than cons. I want your opinion on the fact that the wallet and the keys and the car and the motorcycle are still there. The television is left on and he's not there. There doesn't appear to be a struggle and there's no note left. have you ever covered a case of a missing person, or maybe even just someone that you know the eventual outcome with some of those elements?
This one's different because he's gone. Most of the
Right.
suicides that I would go to that have all those elements, the person would have committed suicide in the residence,
Right.
so, or whatever facility they're at. The one other thing that is missing is a firearm.
Yes.
So that kind of triggers where the suicide theory comes in, and not only was he facing some of these criminal things, but I think his father had high expectations of him. His father was a successful man. He also worked in corrections, but he
Mm.
was more of a state position where he oversaw some things. I think his father was a well-respected man within the community, so maybe there was, I'm not living up to dad's expectations. So that you got to kind of throw that in there too a little bit, I think.
So let's talk about the firearms, because that was one of the first questions I had for you when I contacted you, because there's again, in news reports, it's conflicting reports. It's like he didn't have a gun, he did have a gun, he had two guns. So friends have confirmed, and maybe his father also, that he had some handguns. So there was a 22 caliber handgun that was located in his apartment, and there a 357 and 38 caliber ammo is located, but there's no firearm to match the ammo. And it was reported that he owned a 357 handgun. Is that correct?
Right. And family did confirm when we started sitting down with 2001. We sat down with them just to get a little better take on Jerry and his life. And they did confirm that he did own a 357 handgun at one point. That firearm was not at Jerry's father's place, where most of Jerry's other firearms were, including like hunting rifles, shotguns, things like that.
Right.
And we do know that 38 caliber ammo can be shot out of a 357 caliber firearm. So,
well, you know that, I didn't, but thank you.
So common sense makes me believe, that there was in fact a 357 ammo based on the ammo being or 357 caliber firearm based on the ammos that were located and family and friends saying that he had this.
Right. So I read a quote from a friend. I read two different quotes, actually. One said, if Jerry were going to commit suicide, he wouldn't want to be found. And if Jerry were going to commit suicide, he would want to be found. Do you have any insight on, what that, I mean, there's one quote that said he walked into the marsh and shot himself. Does that sound plausible?
There was a person that came down and spoke with us at the police department. Actually, at the time, his wife was a dispatcher here, and he had worked with Jerry. And unfortunately, one of the other correctional officers at Dodge Correctional committed suicide in the residence, and they apparently had this conversation about basically saying how disrespectful it was to that person's family, because now they got to deal with the cleanup and everything else that you have to deal with a suicide. Jerry made similar comments to, if you're going to go and kill yourself, why don't you just go out to the marsh, shoot yourself, and let the turtles eat the leftover remains. So
wow. Okay. That's a pretty big piece of information. And granted, sometimes we say things that we don't mean. At least I know I do. But that's big. I had never heard that was a quote from him. So that's a fascinating piece of information right there. It doesn't mean that's what he did, but that's pretty interesting. And I agree with the other person that suicide is the most selfish thing in the world that one can do. And everybody has, bad day, bad week, bad month, bad year. But, maybe that thought process is, my family wouldn't have to clean up something if I, do this myself somewhere. I would hope someone would leave a note, but again, we don't know the process. And maybe by the time you get to writing a note, maybe things are already too far gone. But
Right. Just with
I,
all the suicides that I've responded to, it's some leave notes, some don't.
right.
You just never know.
That's a great point. And one of the things that I thought when I heard what was found is that I've spoken to several homicide detectives who were convinced something was a homicide or missing person that was, against their will. But their wallet, their watch, their keys were laid out on a counter. And that's something that some people do when they're, you know, going to kill themselves. I would think that if he had actually talked out loud about allowing nature to dissolve his body, then he didn't care about there being ID to find him. I also, yeah, I mean, one of the searches I worked on here in Southern California was a man whose wife came home from work and his wallet, his keys, his cell phone, his jacket was on the counter and he was gone. But it took till the following day to find blood spatter behind his recliner. And we know that he did not leave of his own free will. So it can go either way. But I was fascinated when this detective said, well, we thought for sure that someone had done something to him, but we found his wallet, his keys, his phone laid out on the counter, almost laid out neatly. I don't know if that, makes a difference or not. I do imagine that if Jerry had gone out to look at a hunting area or a deer stand or anything like that, he wouldn't have left his wallet and phone at home.
I wouldn't think so. When I go hunting, I never leave my phone at home.
Right.
You fall out of a tree stand, you got to get a hold of somebody, right?
There you go. I mean, and even though it was 2002 and cell phones were, sort of new-ish, 8 to 10 years or so of people having them, most everyone having one, you would want that with you anywhere you go. And a man, I mean, I carry a purse that's like the size of a duffel bag because I have to carry all kinds of crap. But men very rarely go anywhere without their wallet and their phone at this point anyway, even in 2002. Yeah. Going over all the theories, probably not wandering out into the woods, getting hurt and never coming back. Probably not taken forcibly from his home, considering his age, his size, his athleticism. It would be difficult for someone to take him forcibly unless it were some sort of ninja surprise attack. But there was no indication that anything like that had happened.
No indication.
Yeah. Could he have gone somewhere with a firearm that no one can locate and done this himself? More than likely. But, I love the fact that you're open to every avenue, to everything that could have happened, because I'm a big believer in pictures, and I know it's just a 1-second snapshot of someone's life, but you look at Jerry's pictures and there's a kindness in his eyes, like a very sweet kindness in his eyes. And if you had told me he was a corrections officer before I knew what he did, I would have been a little surprised because he's got like such a kind face. But maybe it's the kind of face that felt there was too much mounting pressure in his life and he didn't want to be here anymore. I mean, I don't even know what else to say. It breaks my heart to think that that's what he came to, if he did. But I'm really grateful that you are continuing to look for him and looking at all sorts of new pieces of information and evidence and areas. I'm really grateful that you're having another search in the fall of this year on the 20th anniversary of him disappearing. Is there anything else that you want tipsters to know about Jerry or about the case?
I have another theory too. Maybe he is a missing person, and maybe he went and changed his life, changed his name or whatnot. But we do check on that, randomly with all of our federal partners just to make sure something hasn't popped up. So to me, I think that's the least likely situation. But what I do, wish for your listeners to think about if somebody does have any information please get a hold of us, and I can give you the Fond du Lac County tip line. The Waupun Police Department is one of the people or agencies that uses that tip line. That number is 920-906-4777. If you call there and have a tip, just say it's for Waupun Police Department, Jerry Strege case, and whatever the tip is. We haven't had really any successful tips in the last 20 years that pointed us in the right direction, but there's always a chance, and that's my hope for his family, is to get some closure.
One of the other things that I thought was so impressive about the media kit is the aged progressed drawing sketch of Jerry. It's literally like you could see that the age progression. Whoever the artist was is spectacular, and it's really well done. It's probably one of the best well done sketches I've ever seen. I will include that in the social media with his picture as well, in case someone remembers something from 2002, and with the age progressed picture, because I think they're both so fantastic. And I appreciate you bringing up the fact that maybe he walked away from his life. Maybe it was a depression thing. And in 2002, it would have been easier to scrub your life and fly under the radar. It's a little harder now. But if you've had 20 years to establish a new identity, it would be kind of tough,
definitely more tough now.
Right. But back then, that's actually a really great, that's a great point you brought up. I tend to, and we've all heard stories of someone who disappeared and were shocked when we found out they just wanted to get away from their life, even if they had a family and kids. It's always the one I forget about or least think about, because I just think, why would you, second only to killing yourself and what your family is left, what remains for your family to, to push through. Faking your death or walking away from your life is second only to that. It's a selfish move. He doesn't seem like a selfish guy. So, but you never know. Maybe he's living somewhere and maybe someone will recognize him. And I love the push that you're putting toward this case, because it doesn't matter. I love that you also said at the beginning that it's never gone cold. And my favorite detective says, this is not a cold case, it's an old case.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. So Jerry's case is not cold. It's obviously really not cold. It may be old, but it also doesn't mean it won't be, solvable. So if you have any information about Jerry Strege, he was 43 when he went missing. He's 63 now. He's a tall man, 6'3", 230 pounds. He may have been wearing a Seiko or Citizen watch. He might be suffering from PTSD. And I can't thank you enough for coming on to talk about Jerry.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I was kind of surprised when you reached out to me. And
I tend to do that, surprise people.
But it's refreshing. What it does is it pushes me, and our team to keep this in the forefront.
Well, I'm telling you, I know the kids like the TikTok and I don't really care, but I actually did a TikTok video, professing my love for the Waupun Police Department, and you especially, because literally you have been nothing short of amazing. And here, when we first started talking, I had COVID, and then we were going to talk, and then you had COVID. So it's like, everything happens for a reason. It got pushed back, but here we are. And I think it's a perfect time because it's right around the anniversary. And I think people will be thinking about Jerry, because I think this case is a pretty big deal in Waupun. And I hope that it shakes something loose from the trees.
Right, 100%. And last thing that I would like to say is the family appreciates what you're doing for us, Melissa.
It's absolutely nothing. It takes a village, and I know there's a darn good village working on Jerry's case. I'm just happy to be a small cog in the wheel, and it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for talking with me today, Jeremy.
You bet. Have a great day.
That number for the community tip line is 920-906-4777. And if you would prefer to email Deputy Chief, you can get him at jeremy@wapunpd.org. And more cowbell.
If you would like to support this podcast and get early access and other cool murderous swag, go to patreon.com/justthetipsters.